This is the iPhone 7 and this is the iPhone 7 Plus. Now I've recently done the most in-depth performance comparison between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s, which in case you haven't seen, definitely check it out. The results were completely unexpected at the end, but now I really wanted to do another ultimate speed test, this time between the two new iPhones, the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus. Now even though they come with the same Apple A10 processor, the amount of RAM is different. Also the 7 Plus does come with a high resolution display, which might affect performance, and the CPU might be clocked differently between the two models. So hey everyone and welcome to the ZONEofTECH, I'm Daniel, and welcome to my ultimate speed and performance test between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus. So in this video I'll be doing a really in-depth comparison, everything from the specs to the usual Apple on speed test to RAM management, CPU and GPU performance, JavaScript performance, Wi-Fi speed test, fingerprint test, even a 4K video editing test. Everything is covered in this video. So yeah, enjoy. So let's start off with the actual specs. So both on the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus, we have the brand new Apple A10 Fusion chip. So this is essentially a quad-core processor. However, two cores are high performance and the other ones are low performance. And basically when you use high performance apps, only the high performance cores will be used. And those are clocked at 2.34 GHz each. And the only actual spec difference between the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus is in terms of the RAM. So on the iPhone 7 we have 2 GB of RAM, and on the iPhone 7 Plus we have 3 GB of RAM now. So this is the most we've ever had in an iPhone. Really curious to see how much better, if any better, the iPhone 7 Plus will be when we get to the RAM management section. Okay, so the first test that I want to do is the classic boot speed test. So on the left we have the iPhone 7 and on the right we have the iPhone 7 Plus, and I've closed all the apps running in the background before this test, and I've also plugged both phones into the same power outlet, which I'm now going to turn on, so both phones will receive power at the exact same time. So let's see which one will actually boot up first. And the first one to boot up was actually the iPhone 7, not the iPhone 7 Plus, and if you think about it, this actually makes sense because the iPhone 7 comes with a lower resolution display. Now let me just type in my password, and the iPhone 7 also showed the home screen first, so the iPhone 7 definitely seems to take this round. Next up, let's do an app launch speed test. So I've closed all the apps running in the background, and both phones are clones of one another. They're also 32 GB devices, so the flash storage speed should be the same on each. And no, I haven't restored either of them from a backup. They've been both set up as new devices, and I have a set of 12 apps, and I'm going to test and see which phone is going to both launch and load the apps first. So let's start off with Twitter first, and this one pretty much launched at the exact same time on both, so hopefully you can see this better in slow motion. And when it comes to closing the app, again, no differences here either. Next up, let's try Instagram, and this one did launch a tiny bit faster on the iPhone 7 Plus, but again, you won't actually notice this difference. I mean, I had to put it in slow motion to see the difference, and when it comes to closing the app, again, pretty much the same speed on both. Now let's try the settings app, and yeah, so far no differences between the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus when it comes to launching apps. Now let's move on to the camera app. In the iPhone 6s test, the results were really interesting here. So the camera app launched at the exact same time on both. However, when it comes to taking photos, for some reason there's quite a bit of lag on the iPhone 7. We don't really see this on the iPhone 7 Plus, and this seems to apply to both live photos and regular photos as well. Now let's try a couple of more stock apps, the first one being the calculator, and yeah, no difference with this one either, same launch and the same closing speed. So let's try the clock app now, and again, basically the same on both. Both the opening and the closing speeds were pretty much identical on both the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus. So now let's finally move on to some more demanding apps. Let's move on to some 3D games. And here we finally have our first speed difference. The iPhone 7 Plus loaded Temple Run 2 in about 1 to 2 seconds less than the iPhone 7. However, the game was perfectly playable on both at the same time. And the app closing speed once again seems to be identical. Next up, let's move on to one of the most demanding 3D games out there, Dead Trigger 2. And both phones seem to load the app at the exact same time, but now let's see which phone will actually load the game first. And it seems that the iPhone 7 Plus is indeed faster on this one, not by much, just by about 1 second. But overall, it seems that when it comes to demanding apps such as 3D games, the iPhone 7 Plus with 3 GB of RAM does indeed have a slight edge here. Now let's try a different game, this time Hitman Go, and this is one of my favorite games actually. And no, this video is not sponsored by Hitman Go, but yeah, it's basically a mind puzzle game. And apparently the app did launch a bit faster on the iPhone 7 Plus. However, when it comes to entering the actual game, the speed was about the same on both. And closing the app, pretty much the same speed on both. Now let's try the BBC News app, and this is actually the first major difference. The iPhone 7 Plus loaded the app much faster, but it wasn't just the app, it was also the content inside the app as well. Now I'm going to launch the Google Chrome app, I'm not going to use Safari because Safari is actually more optimized for the iPhone 7 Plus than Google Chrome is. So I'm going to try and load, let's say, The Verge. This one was a bit faster on the iPhone 7, and this is probably because the iPhone 7 does have a lower resolution display. So not only does it display less info on the page, but the actual text on the page is also in lower resolution than on the iPhone 7 Plus. Now let's try, let's say, this article. And yeah, this one was pretty much the same on both. But yeah, keep in mind that those two phones are on the same Wi-Fi network, so they are indeed competing for the same bandwidth. And finally, let's try the YouTube app. And this one loaded content much faster on the iPhone 7 Plus. So overall, it does indeed seem that the iPhone 7 Plus is faster when it comes to loading apps. So let me just look for my channel, ZONEofTECH, and let me just look for my iPhone 7 unboxing videos. By the way, in case you haven't seen those, definitely check them out. They're pretty epic. They're also music synced. And yeah, it seems that this one actually loaded faster on the iPhone 7. Now this is most likely because the iPhone 7 does have a lower resolution again, so it loads the video in 720p, whereas the iPhone 7 Plus will actually load the video in full 1080p. Now let's move on to the test you've probably all been waiting for, the RAM management test. So yeah, the main difference between the iPhone 7 Plus and the iPhone 7 is the fact that the iPhone 7 Plus comes with 3GB of RAM, whereas the iPhone 7 comes with 2GB, basically the same amount that the iPhone 6s came with. So I'm going to open up a bunch of websites, the same websites on both the iPhone 7 and the Plus, and then I'm going to go through all the apps I've opened before and see if any of them are still in memory. Okay, so I have the exact same 8 websites open on both, plus those 12 apps that I've opened before, and so far it seems that Temple Run 2 is still in memory and also fully playable on both the 7 and the 7 Plus, and this is actually really impressive. So now let's try, let's say, the camera app, which is also still in memory and ready to go, so far so good on both iPhones. Now let's try Twitter next, also still in memory. Wow. Let's go to YouTube now, and my video seems to still be there on both. So yeah, so far the RAM management has been really impressive on both. So let's try a couple of more apps. So BBC News, this one also loads up perfectly from the memory. Okay, let's move on to the other 2 intensive 3D games. So Hitman Go first, and no issues here on either the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus. And now let's try the most RAM hungry app that I've got opened, that Trigger 2, and wow, this still seems to be in memory on both, and also fully playable. So I was personally not expecting this, or at least the exact same results on both the 7 and the 7 Plus. And finally, let's go back to Google Chrome and see if any of those websites that I've opened before are still in memory. So 9to5 Google is still here, The Verge Pepper's article also here on both. Now let's try The Verge Science News, and it seems that this one did indeed have to load on both the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus. So yeah, it seems that in the end there's no visible difference between the 7 and the 7 Plus when it comes to RAM management. Even though the 7 Plus does come with 3GB of RAM, some apps did indeed load quite a bit faster on the iPhone 7 Plus, but in the end, really impressive RAM management on both. And finally, let's move on to the actual benchmarks, starting off the first CPU benchmark with GeekBench 4. Now, as you can see from the specs shown here, we have the same A10 Fusion, clocked at 2.3 GHz on both the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus, so it doesn't seem that the processor runs at a lower clock on the iPhone 7, but then we can definitely see that we have 2GB of RAM on the iPhone 7 and 3GB on the iPhone 7 Plus. So let's start the test, and since this is GeekBench 4, this one actually stresses the CPU even more with even more tests, and yeah, it actually takes a pretty long time to complete. So far it seems that the iPhone 7 Plus is slightly ahead when it comes to the test, so let me just speed up the process, and it seems that the iPhone 7 Plus finished first in 2 minutes and 42 seconds, and the iPhone 7 finished in 2 minutes and 44 seconds, so just 2 seconds behind. And in terms of the scores, wow, this is pretty impressive. 3,495 on the single core score on the iPhone 7 Plus, and 3,487 on the iPhone 7, so not a big difference. However, for some reason, in terms of the multi-core score, there's a pretty big difference between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus, a 100-point difference between the two. And then if we have a look at more specs, we can see that everything is pretty much identical. We have 3MB of level 2 cache on both the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus. The only differences seem to be obviously in the model ID, the motherboard, and then in terms of the amount of RAM. Next up, let's do an Antutu benchmark, and this one seems to crash again. Yeah, it seems that it hasn't been updated yet for the iPhone 7, which kinda sucks. So no Antutu benchmark yet. So let's move on to the GPU benchmarks, starting off with 3D Mark Icestorm Unlimited. And yeah, this is pretty much an underkill for these phones. It's going to run this test in 720p resolution, and they pretty much finished the test at about the exact same time. Now the iPhone 7 did have a slightly higher score, 38,251, so not a big difference here. And yeah, you can pretty much tell that the app hasn't been updated for the iPhone 7s yet because they're not even recognized. Now let's try that new 3D Mark Slingshot benchmark, and oh, this one seems to crash as well. So this one actually hasn't been updated for iOS 10, so yeah, no Slingshot benchmark either. Now let's move on to some more serious GPU benchmarks with GFX-Bench, and I'm going to start this off with a Manhattan benchmark. So this is going to run on screen at each device's resolution, and yeah, so far it seems that the iPhone 7 Plus does have the edge here, even though it doesn't have any edges. But yeah, the iPhone 7 Plus is definitely faster here, and it seems that the Plus did finish this first and got a score of 55.7 frames per second, whereas the iPhone 7 got a slightly higher score of 58.5. Now this was because of the screen resolution. Since the iPhone 7 Plus comes with a 1080p display, it actually had to render everything in 1080p, whereas the iPhone 7 only rendered the test in 720p. So now let's try and do the same test again, but this time off screen at 1080p, so now the results won't actually be affected by each device's resolution. So 3, 2, 1, go. And it seems that this time the iPhone 7 is actually slightly ahead, but the iPhone 7 Plus did finish the test first. It was about 1 second faster, so not a big difference. However, the iPhone 7 Plus got 61.8 frames per second, whereas the iPhone 7 actually got 62.2. So not a huge difference between the two, to be honest. I was actually expecting the iPhone 7 Plus to outperform the 7, but yeah, overall the difference is negligible. Next up, I want to do some JavaScript benchmarks. So the first one that I'll be doing is SunSpider JavaScript. So this one basically tests out the JavaScript performance in Safari, and it's also highly dependent on the CPU. They should have very similar results. So start. And the iPhone 7 did actually finish this one first, and it got a score of 183 milliseconds, whereas the iPhone 7 Plus got a score of 188. So yeah, the iPhone 7 wins this one by 5 milliseconds. Not a huge difference, but again, it seems that when it comes to raw CPU performance, the iPhone 7 is slightly faster. So now let's try a different JavaScript benchmark, this time Google Octane, and it seems that the iPhone 7 Plus was indeed the first one to finish. The iPhone 7 did get a score of about 500 points higher than the iPhone 7 Plus, so here we have another benchmark in which the iPhone 7 does indeed appear slightly faster than a 7 Plus. Next up, I wanted to do something really interesting. I wanted to do a 4K video editing test, just to see if there's any difference when it comes to 4K video editing in iMovie between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus. So I shot a 1-minute 4K clip with the iPhone 6s because it has a slightly lower bitrate, and then transferred that to both the iPhone 7 and the 7 Plus, and now I'm going to export this video in 4K, so let's see which phone is going to export it first. And so far it seems that the iPhone 7 does have a slight edge here, and they actually finished at the exact same time. Well, the iPhone 7 Plus was like half a second faster, so they were pretty much identical even when it came to 4K video editing. Next up, I wanted to do a Wi-Fi speed test, just to see if we have any improvements, any changes in the Wi-Fi antennas, and if there's any difference between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus when it comes to Wi-Fi reception and Wi-Fi speed. So first off, I'm going to run this test at the same time on both devices, just to see how well these devices manage their bandwidth. My connection is about 100 megabits per second, so I should see about 50 to 60 on each, and the speeds were indeed pretty similar, just a 4 to 6 megabit per second difference, which is usually acceptable. So now let's run the test separately and see which device is faster. So on the iPhone 7 Plus we have 93 megabits per second, 93.66 as the download speed, and 90.18 as the upload speed. And on the iPhone 7 we have 93.96, so pretty much the same as on the iPhone 7 Plus, and 86.98. So only a 3 megabit per second difference in the upload speed. So again, a pretty negligible difference. Number 14, I also wanted to do a fingerprint speed test, just to see if there's any difference between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus unlocking speed, although it shouldn't. So I've cleaned up both home buttons, and I'm going to unlock both phones with my right thumb, and I'm going to record this separately for each phone, and then sync up those videos for accuracy. So first off, with the screen off, and they're pretty much the same. The iPhone 7 does appear a bit faster, so let's try it with the screen on now. And yeah, if you watch this in slow motion, you can see that the iPhone 7 is a tiny bit faster, but yeah, you won't actually be noticing this unless you record it and then put it in slow motion, so basically no difference at all. And finally, number 15, the last test that I want to try out, is pretty much the same as how the whole story began. So let's do a boot test again, but this time turning the devices off. So 3, 2, 1, go. And it seems that both the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus turned off at the exact same time, so no differences here either. So what's my conclusion in all this? Well, the iPhone 7 Plus does indeed come with 3GB of RAM, however in my tests I couldn't see any huge difference. Yes, some of the apps did load a bit faster on the iPhone 7 Plus, however in day-to-day use you won't be noticing any major difference between the two. If you care about performance, the only reason to get the iPhone 7 Plus over the iPhone 7 is in terms of iOS updates. So a couple of years from now, with iOS 12 or iOS 13, maybe that version will only be supported on the iPhone 7 Plus, or if not, definitely some features will be exclusive to the 7 Plus since it has more RAM, 3GB instead of 2GB. So if you care about this, definitely get the iPhone 7 Plus. Besides this, the iPhone 7 is also a really good choice. And there you go, this was my ultimate speed and performance test between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 7 Plus. Also, if you have enjoyed this video, feel free to smash that like button. It took a really long time to make because I wanted to include every single thing into this video rather than making separate videos like for fingerprint test. So yeah, a like would be really appreciated. appreciated. And also check out my iPhone 7 versus iPhone 6s ultimate speed test. The results on that one were really surprising, so definitely check it out. And also subscribe for more in-depth videos like this one. Also feel free to check out my iPhone 7 and my 7 Plus unboxings and first impressions videos. They're music synced, so they're pretty epic. And also let me know in the comments if you were epic enough to make it to the end of this video, and also which ultimate speed test comparison do you want me to do next. Don't forget to turn on notifications on my channel on both desktop and mobile, on all by simply clicking on the bell icon next to my channel so that you're notified whenever I upload a brand new epic video. But yeah, this was pretty much it for this video, pretty long video once again. So thank you all for making it until the end. I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in my next one. ZONEofTECH signing out. Cheers.